April 23, 1945. A small schoolhouse in the ruins of Heidelberg, Germany. 23 women stood in a room, surrounded by American soldiers. What happened next would haunt everyone involved for decades. It started with 4 words: "Show us your tan lines." This is not a story about heroes and villains. This is a story about fear, misunderstanding, and how quickly humanity can be lost and found again. To understand what really happened that day, we need to go back to the beginning. By April 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing. The Third Reich was dying. American forces pushed deep into Germany from the west. Soviet forces advanced from the east. The Nazi war machine was crumbling, but people were still dying every single day. Captain James Morrison knew this reality intimately. 3 days earlier, April 20th, 1945, his unit was clearing a small town near the Rhine River. 2 figures approached the American checkpoint wearing women's clothing, civilian dresses, headscarves. They looked tired, scared, desperate. Private David Jackson, 21 years old from Ohio, waved them through. He even smiled, trying to be kind in a brutal war. That kindness lasted 7 seconds. The 2 women pulled out hidden pistols. They were SS officers, elite Nazi soldiers disguised to escape capture. They opened fire. Private Jackson died instantly. Sergeant Miller took a bullet to the chest and died 2 hours later in a field hospital, calling for his mother. Captain Morrison stood over Jackson's body that night. The young man had a photo of his girlfriend in his pocket. They were supposed to get married when he came home. Morrison made a promise that night. Never again would he lose a man to someone hiding behind a disguise. That promise would set everything else in motion. 3 days later, his unit captured another town. They found 23 German women who had worked in ammunition factories. They needed to be processed, identified, and cleared. Morrison had a new security protocol to prevent another tragedy. That protocol would accidentally create a different kind of tragedy altogether. But first, you need to meet the women. They weren't just numbers or potential suspects. They were human beings, each with a story shattered by war. Greta Hoffman was 24 years old, with brown hair and green eyes that used to sparkle when she laughed. But Greta hadn't laughed in 3 years. Before the war, she wanted to be a teacher. She loved children and books. Then the war came, and the world stopped being beautiful. In 1942, the Nazi government commanded all able-bodied women to work in factories. Greta was sent to Dresden, to a massive ammunition factory operating 24 hours daily. She packed artillery shells with explosive powder, working 12-hour shifts 6 or 7 days a week. The factory was underground to protect it from Allied bombing. Greta didn't see the sun for weeks at a time. In February 1945, the Allies bombed Dresden. The city burned for days. When Greta finally emerged, she didn't recognize her hometown. Everything was ash and death. Her family's apartment building was gone, just rubble. She never found out what happened to her parents. They vanished into the firestorm. Her younger brother Klaus was somewhere on the Eastern Front fighting the Soviets. She hadn't heard from him in 8 months. Every day she wondered if he was alive. When the Americans arrived, Greta felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Maybe the war was finally over. Maybe she could find Klaus. Maybe she could rebuild some kind of life. But standing in that schoolhouse, surrounded by American soldiers, that hope was about to turn into terror. Elsa Schmidt was just 19 years old, the youngest of the group. She'd never wanted to work in a factory or be part of the war. She just wanted to finish school and marry her childhood sweetheart, Johann. Johann was conscripted in 1943 and sent to the Western Front. He wrote her beautiful letters every week, full of dreams about their future together, the house they would buy, the children they would have, the garden she would plant. The letters stopped in January 1945. Elsa told herself he was just busy, that the mail wasn't getting through. But deep down, she knew. She'd seen too many women receive those official letters that started with, "We regret to inform you." When the Americans arrived, Elsa had nowhere to go. Her home was destroyed. Her family had evacuated east, fleeing the advancing Soviets. She had no money, no food, no plan. At 19 years old, she was alone and terrified. She'd heard whispered rumors about what happened to women when armies came through, about violence and assault. She prayed those stories weren't true. She prayed these American soldiers were different. But when she heard the order, "Show us your tan lines," her worst fears seemed confirmed. Frau Margaret Müller was 52 years old. Everyone called her Frau Müller. Before the war, she'd been a school teacher in a village outside Munich, teaching children to read and write and see the world with curious eyes. She'd been married 28 years to Heinrich. They had 3 children. Both sons were dead now. One killed at Stalingrad in 1942, the other in Normandy in 1944. Her daughter Anna had married a soldier who died in North Africa. Anna now lived with her 2 children in a refugee camp somewhere in Bavaria. Heinrich had been conscripted in 1944 despite his age. The Nazis were running out of young men, so they took the old ones. Frau Müller hadn't heard from him in 6 months. She'd lost almost everything, but she still had her dignity. Standing in that schoolhouse, hearing those orders, Frau Müller felt rage building inside her. She had survived 6 years of hell. She had buried her sons. She had watched her country destroy itself. She would not let these men take away the last thing she had left, her dignity. Katharina Vogel was 28 years old and 7 months pregnant. Her husband, a Wehrmacht soldier, had been killed in Italy. She received the letter 3 weeks after discovering she was pregnant. He never knew he was going to be a father. Now, with the war ending, she had no idea how she would survive or feed this baby. But standing in that room with American soldiers staring at her, she had only one thought: I have to protect my baby. Whatever these men were about to do, she had to survive it for the child growing inside her. There were 19 others. Each woman was a universe of pain and shattered dreams. And each woman, in that moment, believed they were about to face one more horror, because they didn't understand what the Americans actually wanted. They only heard 4 words: "Show us your tan lines." Now let me tell you about the Americans, because this story isn't complete without understanding them too. Captain James Morrison was 34 years old, from a small farm in Iowa. Before the war, he'd been a high school history teacher and football coach. He believed in fairness, in doing the right thing, in protecting people. He'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, leaving behind a wife and 6-year-old daughter. Morrison had seen too many of his men die. Every death weighed on him, but Private Jackson's death 3 days ago hit harder because it was preventable. Jackson had been kind, and it got him killed. Morrison didn't hate Germans. He'd read enough history to know that most Germans were just people caught in a terrible machine. But he also knew some were die-hard Nazis who would kill Americans even as their country collapsed. His job was to protect his men. The security protocol he ordered wasn't meant to humiliate. It was meant to save lives. But intentions don't always match outcomes. Sergeant Mike Chen was 29 years old, Chinese American from San Francisco. He'd grown up facing discrimination, people who saw his face and assumed he was Japanese. He'd become a medic because he wanted to save lives, not take them. Chen suggested checking for tan lines as a security measure based on intelligence reports. SS officers in hiding often showed different skin patterns because they'd had access to outdoor facilities, while regular civilians had been trapped indoors in factories. It was a medical observation, a practical security check. Nothing more. Chen had a sister who'd been sent to an internment camp early in the war because the government didn't trust Japanese Americans, even though she wasn't Japanese. He understood what it felt like to be judged by your face instead of your character, to be assumed guilty until proven innocent. When he finally understood what was happening in that schoolhouse, his heart broke, because he realized he'd accidentally done to these German women what had been done to his sister. Corporal Tommy Weber was 25 years old. He'd been born Thomas Weberstein in Berlin in 1920. His family was Jewish. His father was a doctor, his mother a concert violinist. Then 1933 happened. Hitler came to power. Tommy was 13 when the first laws were passed. Jews couldn't go to certain parks or German schools. He was 15 during Kristallnacht, when Nazi mobs burned synagogues and destroyed his father's medical practice. He was 18 when his family fled to America in 1938, leaving behind grandparents too old to make the journey. Tommy never saw them again. He later learned they all died in concentration camps. In America, the family shortened their name to Weber. Tommy learned English quickly, perhaps too quickly, because he started forgetting his German, the language of his childhood, the language of his grandparents. By the time he enlisted in 1943, his German was rusty. When the Army discovered he could speak some German, they made him a translator. He tried to tell them he wasn't fluent, but they didn't care. Tommy came back to Europe wearing an American uniform, liberating the country that had tried to exterminate his people. It felt like justice. When Captain Morrison gave him orders to translate, Tommy's German failed him at the worst possible moment. The medical terminology, the nuanced explanation, the reassurance about privacy, all of it got lost in his limited vocabulary. What came out was harsh and brutal. Show us your tan lines. Remove your clothing. All women must comply. Now, he didn't mean to say it that way, but that's what came out. And in that moment, Tommy Weber accidentally became the villain in a story where everyone was trying to be the hero. Private Marcus Rodriguez stood guard outside the schoolhouse that day. He couldn't hear what was being said inside, but he could hear the women screaming and crying. Rodriguez had 3 sisters back home. Hearing those women cry made him sick to his stomach. He didn't speak German. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew something was wrong. He was the one who ran to get Sergeant Chin. Sometimes the hero isn't the person who gives the grand speech. Sometimes the hero is the person who just notices something is wrong and does something about it. Lieutenant Sarah Collins was 31 years old, a nurse from Boston. Her mother had been Austrian, so Sarah grew up speaking both English and German fluently. She'd been a civilian nurse before the war, working in a children's hospital. Sarah had seen terrible things in this war, but she'd also seen moments of incredible kindness. Soldiers sharing rations with starving children, medics risking their lives to save enemy wounded, humanity persisting even in hell. When Sergeant Chen came running to find her, explaining the disaster unfolding in the schoolhouse, Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her medical bag and ran, not because it was her duty, but because she was the only person who could fix this, the only person who could bridge the language gap and restore some measure of dignity to those terrified women. Now we come to the moment itself. April 23rd, 1945, 2:17 p.m. Captain Morrison stood outside with his orders. Check everyone for security purposes. Make sure no SS officers were hiding among civilians. The intelligence report was clear. Check for tan lines. People working in underground factories for years would have uniformly pale skin. SS officers in hiding with access to outdoor facilities would have distinct tan patterns. Morrison called for his translator and spoke clearly. Tell the women this is standard security protocol. We need to verify identities because enemy combatants have been disguising themselves. We have a female medical officer, Lieutenant Collins, who will conduct private individual examinations in a separate room. She'll check for skin tan patterns that can verify whether someone has been living as they claim. Each examination will be completely private. One woman at a time, female officer only. Any woman who refuses can do so without penalty. We're not here to harm anyone. We're here to protect both our soldiers and civilians. That's what Morrison said. Clear, respectful, reasonable. But here's what Tommy Weber translated in his rusty German. Show us your tan lines. Remove your clothing. All women must comply. No mention of privacy. No mention of a female medical officer. No mention of individual examinations. No mention that refusal was allowed. Just a harsh command. The women's reaction was immediate. Elsa sobbed. Katerina wrapped her arms around her pregnant belly. But Frau Müller stood up, looked directly at the soldiers, and said loudly in German, "No, you will not do this to us. We are not criminals. We are not animals. We have survived bombings and starvation. We have lost everything. And you will not take our dignity." Morrison was confused. Why would they refuse a simple medical examination? He'd made it clear it would be private and conducted by a female nurse. "Tell them again," Morrison said. "Make sure they understand." But Tommy, flustered and embarrassed, just repeated louder. "This is required. You must comply. Show us your tan lines now." The women heard a harsh male voice demanding they strip. Several began crying openly. And that's when Greta Hoffman made a decision showing incredible courage and tragedy. She stood up, wiped her eyes, and spoke to the other women. "Listen to me. We can't stop this. But we can control how we face it. We stand together. We look them in the eyes. We show them we are not ashamed. We are German women. We have dignity. They can order us to do this, but they cannot break us." One by one, the women stood up. 23 women standing in formation, hands at their sides, eyes forward, ready to face what they believed was coming, a mass humiliation, a collective stripping, the final degradation after 6 years of war. They were prepared to comply, not because they wanted to, but because they decided to face it with dignity, rather than beg for mercy that wouldn't come. Private Rodriguez heard the sudden silence after all the screaming. The silence was somehow worse. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening. He made a decision. He left his post and ran to find Sergeant Chen. When Chen arrived and entered the room, what he saw made his blood run cold. 23 women standing in formation, most crying silently, hands shaking. Several had already started unbuttoning their dresses with trembling fingers. They looked like prisoners facing a firing squad. Chen immediately held up his hands and shouted, "Stop! Everyone stop! Don't move!" The women didn't understand English, but they understood the gesture. They froze. Chen turned to Tommy. "What exactly did you tell these women?" As Tommy stammered through his translation, Chen's face went from confusion to shock to horror. "Jesus Christ, Tommy, you told them to strip publicly, right now. You didn't mention private examinations. You didn't mention Lieutenant Collins. You didn't mention one at a time in a separate room. You basically ordered a mass public humiliation. Chen ran back outside. Captain, we have a major problem. The women think we just ordered them to strip naked in front of all of us. They have no idea this is supposed to be private medical exams. Morrison's face went from confusion to absolute horror. Oh my God. Get Collins, Morrison ordered. Now. And find someone who can actually speak German properly. Within minutes, Lieutenant Sarah Collins arrived. When Chen explained what happened, Sarah's face showed the same horror. She took a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and walked into that schoolhouse ready to undo the damage. The moment Sarah entered, the energy shifted. The women saw a female uniform, an American woman. Sarah held up her hands peacefully and spoke in perfect gentle German. Ladies, please, there has been a terrible mistake. Please, may I explain what has actually happened here? The women stared at her, suspicious, hopeful, confused. Frau Müller spoke. You speak German? Yes, Sarah said. My mother was from Vienna. I grew up speaking German. And I need to tell you that what you just heard was completely wrong. Sarah explained everything. My name is Lieutenant Sarah Collins. I'm a nurse. 3 days ago, 2 SS officers disguised as women killed one of our soldiers. Captain Morrison ordered security protocol involving medical examinations to check skin patterns that verify if someone has been working in factories or hiding in better conditions. She paused, ensuring they were following. Here's what was supposed to happen. I was supposed to conduct private examinations, one woman at a time, in a separate, closed room. Just you and me, female medical officer only. I would ask you to remove enough clothing for me to check tan line patterns on your arms, shoulders, and back. A medical examination, nothing more. Each would take maybe 5 minutes. And if any woman refused, that was her right. No punishment. We'd verify identity through other means. The room was silent. Sarah continued. What you heard from our translator was catastrophically bad. He told you to remove clothing publicly. He made it sound like mass humiliation. That is not what we meant. That is not what we wanted. That is not going to happen. Elsa collapsed onto a bench, her body shaking with sobs of relief. Katerina sat down heavily, both hands on her belly, whispering thank you to God. But Frau Müller wasn't ready to accept this. She looked at Sarah with hard eyes. How do we know you're telling the truth? How do we know this isn't just another trick? Sarah met her gaze directly. Honestly, Frau Müller, you don't know. You have every reason not to trust us. You've been through 6 years of hell. Why should you trust anything I say? She paused. All I can offer is my word as a medical professional, my word as a woman, my word as someone whose own mother came from this country and who understands you are not our enemies. You are victims of the same evil we've been fighting, she added. And I can offer you this. Anyone who doesn't trust me doesn't have to be examined. Refusal is allowed. We'll verify identity through other means. It might take longer, but no one will be forced. Frau Müller finally spoke. I will be the first. If this is truly a private medical examination, I will go first. And if you do what you say, the others will follow. Sarah nodded. Thank you, Frau Müller. Your courage is noted. The 2 women walked into a small room. Sarah closed the door. 4 minutes later, the door opened. Frau Müller emerged, clothes properly on, face composed. She looked at the other women. It is as she said. A medical examination. Private, professional. I am unharmed. You are safe. One by one, the women went in. Sarah was gentle, professional. Each woman emerged confirming what Frau Müller said. They were safe. All 23 were examined. All showed pale uniform skin tone of people who'd spent years working underground. Not one showed tan patterns indicating outdoor access and potential SS affiliation. They were exactly who they said they were: factory workers, civilians, victims. When examinations finished, Morrison asked Sarah to gather everyone. He wanted to apologize. "Ladies," Morrison said through Sarah's translation, "my name is Captain James Morrison. What happened to you today is inexcusable. You have survived years of war. You have lost everything. And today my unit terrorized you through incompetence, through failure to communicate. I cannot undo the fear you felt, but I can tell you, you are not our enemies. You are not criminals. You are civilians, caught in a war none of us wanted. I am deeply, truly sorry." Some women cried hearing this, from relief, from the unexpected grace of an apology. Then Morrison asked Tommy forward. Tommy entered, face streaked with tears, hands shaking. Through Sarah, Tommy spoke. "My name is Thomas Weberstein. I was born in Berlin. My family was Jewish. We fled in 1938 to escape the Nazis. I lost my grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, all to concentration camps. When I came back in this uniform, I thought I knew who my enemies were. Today I learned I was wrong. You are not my enemies. You are victims, just like my family. And I, in my anger and broken German, nearly victimized you again. I am so sorry." Tommy broke down completely, sobbing. Then something remarkable happened. Greta Hoffman stood up, walked over to Tommy, and put her hand on his shoulder. In German she said, "We thought you were monsters. You thought we might be hiding monsters. In war, everyone is so afraid we see monsters everywhere. Thank you for showing us you are human, like us." It was the beginning of healing. Over the following weeks, bonds formed. Chin treated Elsa's infected hand daily, teaching her English words. She taught him German songs. Rodriguez showed Frau Müller photos of his family. His 3 sisters reminded her of her daughter Anna, who she still hadn't located. Rodriguez promised to help. He put in Red Cross requests. 3 weeks later, they found Anna alive in a refugee camp in Bavaria with her 2 children. Rodriguez arranged transport. The day Frau Müller left, she hugged Rodriguez so tightly he couldn't breathe. "Thank you," she said in broken English. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." Morrison helped Greta write letters trying to locate her brother Klaus. They never found him. Klaus had died on the Eastern Front in March 1945, just 1 month before war's end. But Morrison sat with Greta when the confirmation came, held her hand while she cried, just sat with her in her grief. One evening, Katerina went into premature labor. Sarah and Chen delivered the baby right there. A tiny girl, 4 pounds, barely alive. They worked through the night. At dawn, the baby stabilized. She would live. Katerina named her Sarah, after the nurse who had saved her life and her mother's dignity. Tommy spent those weeks doing penance. He helped every woman with whatever they needed. Most importantly, he spent hours daily practicing German with them, relearning the language he'd tried to forget. The women taught him patiently, laughed with him when he made mistakes. It was forgiveness in action. On the day the last woman left, they gathered for a photograph. 23 German women, 15 American soldiers, standing together. People who should have been enemies, who had been enemies for a few terrible hours, who found their way back to being human beings. Each woman received a copy before she left. The war in Europe ended 2 weeks later, May 8, 1945. Morrison and his unit stayed 6 more months, then went home. Morrison returned to Iowa, to his wife and daughter, went back to teaching history, never talked much about the war, but he kept that photograph on his desk until he died in 1982. Chen went back to San Francisco, became a doctor, opened a practice in Chinatown, treating anyone regardless of ability to pay. He kept the photograph in his office. Collins stayed in. The Army, made colonel, specialized in cross-cultural medical care, trained thousands in cultural sensitivity. The photograph went everywhere she was stationed. Rodriguez went home to Texas, married his sweetheart, had 4 daughters, taught them to see people as people, not enemies. The photograph hung in his living room. Tommy struggled with guilt for years. He became a professional translator for the State Department, making it his mission to bridge cultural divides and prevent miscommunication. He donated to refugee organizations annually. The photograph sat on his work desk, a reminder of his worst moment and the grace he'd received. The women scattered across Germany, rebuilding lives from ash. Greta eventually became a teacher, just as she'd dreamed. Every year she showed students the photograph and told them the story about fear, misunderstanding, and forgiveness. She never married or had children, but touched thousands of lives through teaching. When she died in 1998, former students came from all over Germany. They remembered her most important lesson: always look for humanity in others, especially when you're afraid. Frau Miller was reunited with Anna and her grandchildren. She lived with them until 1961. She kept the photograph on her mantle. Her grandchildren grew up hearing the story about the day she thought she'd lose her dignity and found unexpected kindness. Elsa eventually learned Johann had died, as she'd feared. She mourned deeply, but she rebuilt, met someone else, married, had 3 children, named her first son Johann. Katerina raised baby Sarah as a single mother. Post-war Germany was devastated, but she survived. When Sarah was 18 in 1963, Katerina helped her travel to America to find Lieutenant Sarah Collins. They found her at Fort Bragg. The reunion was tearful and beautiful. Young Sarah met the woman she was named after. November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. An elderly woman stands in the crowd watching the wall come down. She's 68 now, white-haired, deeply lined, but her green eyes are still alert. Greta Hoffmann watches young people dancing on the wall, watches families reuniting, watches the end of one more chapter of Germany's painful history. Her student's granddaughter stands beside her. "Oma," the girl asks, "is it really over? The war? The division?" Greta smiles. "The war ended 44 years ago, Liebchen, but healing takes longer. Maybe it's never fully over, but we keep trying. We keep choosing to see each other as human beings, not enemies." The girl notices Greta holding something, an old photograph, faded and creased from 1,000 foldings. "Who are they, Oma?" Greta looks down. "These are the people who taught me the most important lesson of my life." What lesson? That fear makes us see monsters where there are only humans. That miscommunication can create tragedies. But also that courage, the courage to apologize, to forgive, to try to understand, can create miracles. She points to people in the photo. That's me at 24. That's Frau Müller. That's little Elsa. There's the translator who nearly destroyed us with his bad German. There's the nurse who saved us, the medic, the captain, all of them. What happened to them? Some stayed in touch. Letters, Christmas cards. Some I never saw again. But we were all connected by that one day. That terrible, beautiful day when everything almost went horribly wrong and somehow turned out okay. The granddaughter looks closer. They don't look like enemies. That's because they weren't. Not really. They were just people caught in a war, scared people trying to survive. And when they finally saw each other clearly, when the misunderstanding was fixed, they recognized each other as what they really were. Humans, just humans. Greta looks up at the wall coming down. Remember this, Liebchen. Remember that walls fall, wars end. But what remains is how we choose to see each other. As monsters, or as humans who sometimes make terrible mistakes but can still find grace. Can I keep this photograph someday? Greta smiles. Yes, when I'm gone, it's yours. But promise me something. You have to tell this story to your children, to their children, because the world will always need reminding that even in our darkest moments, humanity can survive if we're brave enough to look for it. I promise, Oma. Greta Hoffman died in 1998 at age 77. The photograph passed to her granddaughter, who kept her promise. She told the story to her children, her students, anyone who would listen. The photograph still exists, passed to the fourth generation. A reminder that history isn't just about great battles and famous leaders. Sometimes history is about 23 women and 15 soldiers who found their way from fear to understanding in a ruined schoolhouse in Germany. So what's the point of this story? Because it reminds us that evil isn't usually a monster. Evil is usually a mistake, a misunderstanding, fear taking over when communication breaks down. The Americans weren't evil. They were scared soldiers trying to protect themselves. The women weren't evil. They were exhausted survivors trying to get home. Tommy wasn't evil. He was a traumatized refugee making a catastrophic error. But when evil accidentally emerged from good intentions gone wrong, something remarkable happened. People chose to fix it, to apologize, to forgive, to see each other's humanity despite every reason not to. In a world that seems increasingly divided, in a time when we're quick to assume the worst about people different from us, in an age when miscommunication happens constantly, this story matters. It reminds us to pause, to clarify, to ask if we really understood, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to recognize that most people are not monsters. They're just humans, scared and trying their best, and sometimes getting it catastrophically wrong. And it reminds us that apology has power, that forgiveness has power, that the courage to admit when we've hurt someone, even accidentally, can transform enemies into friends. 23 women, 15 soldiers, one terrible mistake, and a grace that somehow emerged from the wreckage. That's the story of Show Us Your Tan Lines. A story about the day humanity almost died in a schoolhouse in Germany, and about the people who brought it back to life. May we all have the courage to do the same when our turn comes.